Welcome back to the Farmer's Market channel. Today we're going to be doing our second build guide, this time on Futaba. If you're unfamiliar with this series, we review a character's skills, how their skills work, their weapons, and much more. Our goal is to leave you with an understanding good enough that you can build your own strategies, or at least understand how these characters work. Futaba is our first limited navigator, and while a lot of people skipped Phoebe, this is going to be a very popular character and a character that stays in the meta for a long time. Just like the last time, we're going to do a structured breakdown of what her goal is, her skills, weapon, optimal revelations card set, awarenesses, and her teams. So let's get on with it. Futaba is best known for her ability to turn an enemy's strengths into weaknesses, but it's a little more complex than that. Something I should probably make clear moving forward, since we haven't done a Navi guide yet, Navis obviously don't have highlights, so instead they get 3 passives. Typically, the first passive is universal for navigators, increasing ally stats by either 15% or 20% of the navigator's stats. 5-star navies get the 20% buff, while 4-star navigators have the weaker version of the skill. The next thing we'll do is check out her A0, since it'll give us a basic idea for Kid. Futaba's A0 is called Data Scan. Futaba gains 5% of a buff called Analysis Progress every time a character uses a Persona skill. 20% is gained when allies deal weak damage with Persona skills, follow-up attacks, or highlights. Her second, unrelated A0 effect is giving allies a 20% damage buff when they have the buff called Data Storm. This effect also doubles if the damage being dealt is weak damage. Since the A0 description doesn't explain what that is, we'll wait for it to come up again before I get into that. Now that her A0 has been outlined, we'll move on to skills. Keep in mind, for all skills, we're going to discuss stats based on their max level with no awarenesses. Skill 1 is called Pen Test Complete. Pen Test Complete has a 4-action cooldown and reduces all enemy defense by 6% for 3 turns. It also stacks an additional 0.53% of points of defense reduction for every 100 attack Futaba has, up to 4,600. This adds up to 30.38% at max scaling. The debuff this applies is doubled when enemies take weak damage. This is the main part of the skill you need to pay attention to, but with skills involving analysis progress gain, this additional effect follows. All allies will be given the buff Data Storm if you're at 100% analysis progress for 2 turns. We'll see this buff again in skill 2 as well, so I'll get more into what it does there. Skill 2 is called Vulnerability Found, and it's another 4-action cooldown skill that increases one enemy's damage taken by 6%, with an additional 0.57% added for every 100 attack Futaba has. Again, this is up to 4,600, just like her skill 1. This adds up to 32.22% at max scaling. For the 3-turn cycle that Vulnerability Found is active, allies gain 20% analysis progress after dealing damage with Persona skills, follow-ups, or highlights. In short, this skill's main focus is boosting analysis progress gain, since this stacks with the up to 20% progress you can gain just with her A0 effects. Once again, at 100% analysis progress for 2 turns, you'll receive the buff Data Storm. As described in her A0, Data Storm is a buff that applies up to 20% additional damage to all allies, which doubles when dealing weakness damage. Additionally, in the 2.4 global livestream, it was revealed that Skill 2's bonus scaling was increased from 0.38 to 0.57. This change increases the total debuff from the original 23.48% to the 32.22% that we see on global with her release. Skill 3, Data Link Established, is an 8-action cooldown skill. It's not only Futaba's best ability, but also her character-defining one. After selecting this skill, you pick a party member and buff their attack by 270. This has an additional 21.7 attack for every 100 of Futaba's attack, up to 4,600. Afterwards, as a secondary effect, Futaba casts Disruption Virus on all enemies. This debuff changes enemy resistances. On enemies that null, repel, or absorb, they're changed to resist. If they resist, they're turned to neutral. And if they're neutral, they become weak. Best of all, if they're weak to an element, and you use this ability on them, it increases their weak damage taken by 25%. Skill 3 is far and away Futaba's strongest move, acting as a buffed version of Tarot Kaja, but also giving the enemy team a pretty significant debuff, all in a single turn. Before we move on to her weapon, let's do a quick overview of her passives, since there isn't really much to say. We already discussed her Universal Navi passive, Passive 1, but let's go over Passive 2 and Passive 3. Passive 2, Programming Pro, ensures that you start every battle with 100% analysis progress. Starting with full analysis progress means you'll have Data Storm after using either skill 1 or 2, leading into her skill 3. Essentially, this passive helps to set up skill 1 into skill 3, that sort of rotation back and forth. Passive 3, Rootkit, gives allies a 30% attack shield for 3 turns, as long as you have the buff Data Storm. It could help provide some damage decrease during a DPS turn for characters like Mesa, and maybe even contribute to one of Yusuke's passives. None of Futaba's passives are anything crazy, but I wanted to make sure we reviewed them for completeness' sake. As far as leveling priority and her rotation, her skill 1 and 3 are typically going to be your main rotations, so definitely focus your materials on those two first. Even though skill 2 received a pretty solid buff, unless you're struggling to reach that 100% analysis progress, there's not a lot of rotations where you really need to use this. Now, we can move on to her awarenesses. Since A0 was more of a description of her kit, like always, we'll start with A1. A1 is going to be an incredibly popular awareness for Futaba, and there's a good reason why. It increases all ally crit rate by 12% when you're at 100% analysis progress or when allies are in Data Storm. The reason this is such a popular awareness is because of the breathing room it gives you for crit rate in your builds. This buff, combined with inherited crit rate, Chords A1, things like that, is almost definitely enough to raise a DPS's max crit rate to 100% with a single use of Rebellion. This means that Futaba can use a crit mult card instead of a crit rate one, which your unit will inherit 20% of via her stats. We'll get to substats later. I just wanted to detail why her A1 is so good. Let's move on to Awareness 2. Awareness 2 gives allies a 25% attack buff when they attack enemies that have debuffs from Futaba. Also, if a party member takes a hit that would otherwise kill them, it's prevented, and all allies get a shield that matches 20% of Futaba's attack. This effect can only activate once per battle. A3 is just a buff to her skill 3 and her skill 2. A4 gives Futaba a brand new buff called Security Flaw. After any party member uses a highlight, you gain a stack of it. It caps at 2 stacks. When Futaba uses her skill 1 or her skill 2, it consumes Security Flaw stacks and strengthens the selected skill by 8% per stack. If you're interested in pulling the Persona 3 characters later on, this works with their version of highlights too. Awareness 5 is a buff to Futaba's skill 1, and Awareness 6 is a major buff to Futaba's skill 3, essentially turning it into a stronger version of Dominion's move Cohesion. It takes the effects of her skill 3, applying it to the entire party. The second part of her A6 takes all the main elements from each party member and makes the targets weak to all of those elements. The third part of her A6 extends Data Storm status to 3 turns instead of 2, which just makes the party buff longer. The final part of her A6 increases all ally weak damage by 10% and regular damage by 25%. Overall, it definitely feels like they just kind of threw everything at the wall with her A6, but it really does seem like her first and 6th awarenesses are the best ones. The A6 buff adding extra weaknesses is a nice feature, but it won't come into play nearly as much as characters like Chords, where hers is something you can use for almost every piece of content in the game. It would be a great A6 to have for a team with 2 DPS characters, but that's not something we're seeing a ton of so far. If you're watching this video, I'd say there's about a good 50-50 chance you're considering going for her A1, and I do think it's pretty worthwhile. It adds a good amount of flex to crit rate in your team builds. Just to play devil's advocate though, I really don't think it's a must-have either. Anyway, now we're going to be talking about Futaba's weapons. There really isn't a whole lot to say, with her 4-star at max dupe increasing attack by 24%, and increasing damage taken by enemies by 19% for 2 turns after using Futaba's skill 3. Not a bad 4-star. Next up, we have the Technomage Ultra FS, which, like most 5-star weapons, increases attack by 30% as a base effect, But for its second effect, when allies deal weakness damage, their attack is increased by 10% for 2 turns. For its final effect, when Futaba inflicts debuffs, those foes' crit damage taken is increased by 7.6% for 3 turns, and up to 2 stacks. This is an interesting weapon because we do have an interest in stacking crit molt on Futaba, so an extra 15% and a 10% attack boost never hurts. It doesn't really alter your build that much, but considering a lot of Futaba's build is just party-based buffs to stats, I think it's a piece of the puzzle. Speaking of puzzles, let's move on to the major section of the video, Revelations cards. Futaba's Revelation card set is Labor, with 2 different choices for your space card, either Resolve or Integrity. Integrity increases all ally HP, attack, and defense by an additional 2% for each ally with the same element, and Resolve, your other option, decreases a main target's defense by 10% for 2 turns after debuffs are inflicted. Resolve is definitely the better pick here, but if you don't have it, you don't have it. The other thing is, if you have a really great Integrity card with the right teams, it might be decent. The real issue is that the only mono teams we have so far are the Nuke team and the Fire team, who really like Phoebe anyway, and that's kind of what you need for Integrity to be more worth it, so I think Resolve is definitely the way to go if you have a good one. Unlike the space cards, we don't get a choice for your main cards. Labor is just the meta set for nabbies moving forward. They increase HP, attack, and defense by 8% for all allies, with a 4 stack of cards. For our stat options, our Sun, Moon, and Planet are easy choices, with Sun being HP as always, and Moon and Planet both being attack cards. You might notice I left her star card out of that description, and it's for good reason. This is the decision that turns this build into being something with a lot of wiggle room to being a build that can be incredibly frustrating to get right. The star card on Futaba can either be crit rate or crit molt. Personally though, I think it should be crit molt, and here's why. Crit rate is a stat recommended on most DPS. You'll see it a lot in their star card slot. At the very least, you probably have crit rate added up to about 20% on the low side, closer to 40% on the high side. Rebellion, a move in a ton of rotations, buffs crit rate by about 15.7% at max, and you see it in a lot of Nightmare Gateway and SOS guides. A1 Chord, a very popular awareness, increases the highest ally's critical rate by 15%. We'll also get access to the inner ring of the Mindscape later on, where characters like Queen will get access to free crit rate later on as well. My point is, the game sees a lot of crit rate creep over time, and there may be a lot of ways you receive crit rate that you don't know about, like your Q level, and you may find yourself near 100% as it is when you're done with your rotation. Because of Futaba's 20% stat sharing, I think crit molt is the better pick since it doesn't cap out and it has a higher ceiling. Once again though, if you do pick a crit rate card, it's not the end of the world, just make sure you try to get a lot of crit molt substats so you get the most out of her build. But your biggest and most important substat to see on Futaba cards is attack percent. If you get attack percent and attack flat, that's even better, but attack percent is the one you should be favoring. Crit rate is a stat that I think is a lot better as a substat, since you likely don't need as much as you would a main stat would give you. Crit molt is another great substat for her. Seeing a combination of these 4 stats, the crits and the attacks, is generally a good thing. Unfortunately, Futaba has a lot of substats she really doesn't want to see on her cards. Any kinds of HP and defense are pretty useless, and ailment accuracy has a very niche use for harder teams. One thing that's nice is that the speed stat helps the team dodge a bit more. It's not nearly as negative of a stat as it would be on a DPS character, so if you run into it as a 4th stat and you have a really good card other than that substat, it's not the end of the world. Since that was a lot, let's do a quick recap. Futaba wants the Resolve Labor set, with cards in this order: HP, Attack, Crit molt, and More Attack for main stats. For substats, Attack should be your most wanted stat, and then either Crit Rate or Crit molt. As an absolute last resort, Attack molt could be a decent 3rd stat, but Attack percent is going to be more valuable, and it kind of leeches onto those characters a little better with her first passive. Please let me know if you have any questions relating to the Revelations cards, since they're usually the most confusing parts of these builds in this game. Another note I wanted to make on Revelations cards, as far as perfecting her set goes, I wouldn't worry too much about it. If you're pulling Haru in 2.6, one thing that's nice with this set is the two characters use the same Revelations card Metaverse slot, Pleasure and Labor. So as you're building this set, you can work on Futabas and you can work on Harus at the same time. Also, this is just an all-around popular Navi set, so you really can't have too many labor cards. In my first guide, this was the section where I talked about character teams. Futaba is interesting because the teams will just sort of come to her. There's definitely something to be said for the mono teams drifting towards Phoebe, like the Queen Vino Leon team, the On Fire team, and the upcoming duo side team of Haru and Summer Moko. But if you don't have Phoebe, or if you slot Cord on one of those teams, even then, the consistent buffs and debuffs Futaba provides haven't really been seen by a Navi in this game so far, so I'm thinking most teams will drift towards this character. No matter how you build her, she's going to be a great character. The last thing I wanted to mention is that we're starting to think about hosting streams here on YouTube. At first, they'd be more sporadic, but if you guys take an interest in them, we'll host them more. These could center around P5X, other Atlas games, or maybe even other JRPGs, but we would take questions and talk with the audience. We really like hearing from you guys. We're trying to make an effort to reply to most of the comments. Since we don't really talk about things like pull priority, character tiers, things like that, we're trying to steer away from those types of videos. We figure a stream could be a good place to have more opinionated or specific chats about the game. Let us know the kinds of things you might want to see out of a stream from us, like the game or talking points. And as always, if you have suggestions for videos, we do take them very seriously. Good luck on your pulls, everyone, and thank you for watching.